Hi, that was really cool for all of you. I have a question about the salinity modeling, Xiaochen, and your modeling too about the two-wave, and I'm not a modeler, okay. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of the freshwater saltwater interface in the subterranean estuary and the impact of your hydrodynamic flow on SGD, whether it's incorporated in your model or not, like whether you have a source of freshwater, say, from depth from your water table when you're simulating that intrusion of the storm event. And also, it was really interesting to see how in your two-way modeling, you had also the water table simulations. Is that right?
The groundwater table.
The groundwater table. So I was just wondering if you guys could speak a little bit more to that, because that's really interesting to me.
First. Oh. Sorry, maybe I first. So right now, so for the two-way coupling, the salinity has the information of salinity has not changed. So just the water level. So the water can be changed, but the salinity not changed. So the river is still totally fresh water. And the ocean definitely can have like an impact of fresh water on the salinity. But this effect have already similar to the one-way coupling, because the salinity is not changed. And for the right now, one way they have the river ocean coupling, land ocean coupling. So so the water can actually, they have a natural flow from the land grid cell to the ocean grid cell. This can impact the ocean salinity. So through the groundwater, that your understanding is correct. However, because in this case, in our simulation, the grid cell is a little coarse. And another reason is that we have not represented the inter-grid cell like a groundwater flow. So only the grid cell neighboring to the ocean, land grid cell neighboring to the ocean grid cell, they can contribute to this like a freshwater flow. But in reality, because they have like a land grid cell, between the land grid cell, they also have a water flow. So this effect can contribute to make this effect stronger. Right now, we found that the major effect is the infiltration of fresh water to the infiltration of the salty water to the land grid cell. This is the larger effect than the natural flow.
Any other questions? Oh,
yeah. You want to skip? Yeah, it's fine. So in our coupling, so first we use a different structure modeling. We use the structured model is a square. I think it's different from Dr. Tan's model. And first, in the hydrological part, we use the Wharf Hydro. So Wharf Hydro itself is covered the entire coastal land, regardless of river or not a river. So basically, it's a land or river channel. It can resolve that. But the hydrological model is a 2D model. And so the exchange between the hydrological model and the ocean model is focused on the surface salinity dynamics. One reason is because the motivation for this study or this project is investigate what happened during the hurricane events, which is a very extreme events. We have the heavy precipitation on the land covers entire watershed. So basically during the hurricane, the soil will very fast saturated by the precipitation. So in this case, the vertical exchange between the surface and the subsurface is not the dominant process, because basically there's no very limited exchange, the vertical exchange. So we hadn't include this part for this case. And but definitely that's future. Actually, we are working on that to achieve. For achieve this goal, actually the hydrological model itself is already include the surface, subsurface routing and the groundwater model. And currently, I think especially the land surface model in the hydrological model is non-MP. It can resolve all the way down to the 2 meter below surface ground soil surface and include the groundwater. Yes.
Because I
Mhm.
noticed that with
Microphone.
your 3 different experimental conditions or the
Different model.
your different model,
Yeah, yeah.
excuse me, that soon after the hurricane event, there was quite a drop in salinity in your observations for your wetland estuary site.
Yeah, yeah.
But the model simulations couldn't capture that really sharp drop. So I'm just wondering if you did include this other boundary condition, or what I think of as a boundary condition, which might be like a freshwater pulse
Okay.
from groundwater, whether that could capture it.
Yeah,
But I don't know if it's
Yeah,
possible.
I got
in
your
a
point.
model.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
one of the comments from the reviewer. Okay, yeah. Thank you, yeah. Yeah, actually, that's I think if I remember correctly, that's just right after hurricane made landfall. There is a 3 days or 4 days overestimate. I think that based on what I investigated, that's because the reason I just mentioned I mean, of course, the hurricane, the precipitation will quickly separate the soil, but before it's fully separated, it still has, I assume there's still, but we didn't include that. That's the part we want to improve. So, any interest, we can continue, yeah, collaborate on this, yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks for great talks. I have a slightly, I guess, technical question to Stanley. It's coming from my collaborators. In your model, do you use different diffusion coefficient for different constituents of DIC, like carbonate, bicarbonate, or is it fixed in the model?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so what we did, yeah, indeed, we did calculate the diffusion coefficient for all DIC component and then sum that up for the total DIC. That's what we did in the model. Yeah, sum that up into one. Okay, you have a question?
No, they're just saying that there's only one for the whole DIC. So
No, no,
basically,
I think what our question, I think you're saying like the different contribution to the total DIC, right? Or to total carbonates. I don't.
yeah, well, if there was one for CO2 to minus,
Yeah, yeah.
CO3 to minus,
Eight,
CO2
yeah,
on HCO3, but there was only one, so which is the major. The
Yeah,
one
yeah.
for the-
So well, and to your question, I think what we did was that so all the different components that makes up the total DIC, we had all of the diffusion coefficient all summed up to get the total DIC one. So the one you saw from there is the sum. That hope that answer your question. Okay.
Yeah, this is great. Yes, great presentation. I'm trying to think about as an experimentalist, right? We have 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional in the water column, but we only have 1 dimension in the sediment. How do we reconcile that with the bench modeling now in multi-dimension? Tell me how many cores I need to analyze, right? What resolution do we need?
I think from my side, I mean, that's one of the things that we were planning on working on. I showed that later on in my slide where we're trying to, see if we could move toward kind of like a more regional scale or coastal modeling where we could have a 3D representation of the system. So, yeah, it's something that we could probably we're currently working on in that sense, but mostly, at least for the sediment side, we do know mostly things vary vertically. So that's what we did. But the goal is to at least eventually to get that very highly resolved sediment model 1D in a 3D mode. That is what we're trying to do in the future.
I'm also going to add that models like this have been implemented in 3D before. So I know I've done some work. I know Jeremy Test has done some work. And it just depending on like what type of chemical capabilities you're looking for, and what type of vertical resolution you're looking for. And so in one sense, but those are in one sense, they're still 1D because it's each grid cell is 1D, right? We don't have groundwater flowing through the seabed. So I think that's the harder question that would take more time to do, is to model like the submarine estuary, or something like that. But yeah, I think as Stanley's like upcoming model and we have the capability to do it. The question is, we would always love more cores. Yeah.
So Stanley, just to follow up on that question, maybe you explained this in your model. So when you have 10 centimeter of event-led redeposition, you are changing the characteristics of that sediment. So your porosity is changing, your organic carbon content, grain size is changing. How do you handle that in this model?
Yeah. Of course, that it's a very, really complex thing, and that is exactly where we try to use this. I showed something about the carbon enrichment factor. Of course, we also have the depth there. So we try to make like a very basic kind of parameterization of that complex features that you would normally observe in that 10 centimeter of the sediment. So that is what we did. Of course, maybe perhaps it might not be sufficient because we had a lot of issues trying to fit that particular parameter for all of the samples that we have. So, and you could imagine like different floods will come with their own different way of expressing that particular coefficient. So it's quite a kind of a challenge, but I think the way we did it, I think it was sufficient enough for the kind of application we did. And I think one of the things I keep saying is that we were data limiting when we started the whole modeling exercise. But hopefully with more data, we can start better, maybe making more better estimation of that function. Yeah.
My turn. Thanks. Yeah, I would have a ton of questions regarding these continuous coupled models from the land to the ocean, but because it's far from my field, I also restrain myself. But maybe we can have discussions about that afterwards. This two-way coupling, I really like the idea, and I think it's a cool way to go. Now I have a question for Julia for this resuspension exposure time, the oxygen exposure time, because we discussed that quite extensively during the breakout groups. And I was when you calculate that, you calculate when there is resuspension, you also take into account, I didn't quite get that from your explanation, but if you also take into account the time that the particles and how you get that, the time, because the time the particles spend in the water column, because you also showed in the models you did for the Mississippi, I guess for the Louisiana shelf, that it was really very important in terms of consuming oxygen, which for the hypoxia and producing the IC and so on. So how do you handle that in your calculation that you showed for this exposure time?
So, so I think there's two answers to that question. So the first is just like locally, how are we going from like seabed elevation changes to time spent in the water column? And so I'm assuming that anytime there's a dip in the seabed, that the material is suspended, right? And so what it's not accounting for is things in terms of like, if you have different grain sizes, I'm averaging over all of like the grain size specific things here. You could probably do it. I think you could do it if you had like use different Rouse profiles or more results from the hydrodynamic sediment transfer model. You could do it for grain size specific, but we haven't. I think the other part of your question was like the time to get to the site, or no? Did I answer your question?
No, that was more like, yeah, that was more like how you calculate the time that the particles spend in the water column when it's gets suspended, because it's hard to figure out depending on the grain size you said. So on, so you took an average grain size and so you calculated the time to settle back. That's it. Yeah, well, for the consumption, for the concentration of suspended material you had.
So if you don't, if you assume it cannot be laterally transported, then anytime you get a dip in the seabed, then it has to be suspended, is the answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the great talks of all these models across different scales. I guess I have one more of a discussion for all of you. So if we were to couple different scales and connect the models, how sensitive would your model be to the selection of boundaries? So I can make it more specific. I guess for Xiaochen's model, you have a fixed boundary from the hydrological model to the hydrodynamical model. And if you were to move it, say, onshore 2 kilometers or towards the ocean 2 kilometers, because I know for hydrodynamics, they would also do wet and dry under like flooding or storm conditions. And for hydrological model, probably the wet and dry is fixed. So how sensitive would your coupling be if you draw the division of 2 modules differently?
Okay, so for the ocean model, we use the boundary from our 1 kilometer Gulf of Mexico modeling. It's a very well calibrated and a validation model, has a number of publications from our group and with a collaborator from the coastal model. So we directly extract the simulation, boundary condition and initial condition from that model. And for the hydrological model, we as I mentioned, this is an extreme case, and we don't have the boundary. We don't need the boundary condition. Actually, the most important input is the forcing. We should have very accurate precipitation during the hurricane events. For example, we can use the National Water Model reanalysis data or an LDS model, or yeah, whatever is as long as it's accurate precipitation. So for the sensitivity, that's because the precipitation is the most important for the hydrological model. We need the other will be okay, but to make sure precipitation is one. But for the normal case, as we have applied this model to the operational, we provide the 3D forecast using this model. The boundary condition, we basically for the hydrological model, we can extract the data from the observation, or we can use our own forecast for the river as a boundary to put into the hydrological model. Same for the ocean, we used our forecast from the 1 kilometer Gulf of Mexico model. Yeah, answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to Xiaochen had said, so I want to add something for the hydrological model, also the hydrodynamic side. So for the hydrological model, if you just consider the event scale, this is what Xiaochen has said. So this is the most important data you should consider is the atmospheric forcing. So especially the precipitation. But if you want to run a longer time scale, a climate scale, so you need to consider the like antecedent soil moisture, so the water table. Then the other factor will play a larger role, such as vegetation, ET, how the ET groundwater, how they affected by the vegetation. So this is the considering the time scale, you consider you need to different processes for the ocean side. Right now, for the East Horizon model, they don't have a boundary condition. So if you want to run a specific region, the ocean model just does the whole global ocean. So so in that case, the uncertainty mainly come from the model area of this ocean component, MPSO. But I actually, from my own experience, there are some model using the like a regional ocean model. They can impose the ocean boundary condition. So usually they are very accurate, but the major uncertainty I think is from the bathymetry data. If you have a good bathymetry and have a very accurate like boundary condition, your submitted water level should be very accurate because this is just a mass balance issue, right?
Julia, I really like the way you explained that shallow penetration depth versus deeper penetration depth and how it's a double-edged sword. And following up on that, also when it's a shallow penetration depth, the overlying water often has a lot less oxygen, and the reverse is true. How does that factor in the remineralization rate?
I also have a reviewer who said that. So it's something I'm thinking about. Right now it's we're assuming the water column is oxic, but of course, if it's resuspended from an anoxic sediments into anoxic water column, then you're not getting oxygen exposure. I agree. Yeah. But so I will say, but in a lot of sites, like at that Rhone site, even when we have centimeters of resuspension and it's organic rich material that you're resuspending, it's when you have that much resuspension, the water column's often mixed. And so I think what we're not getting is things like gravity, like the fluid muds. But if you don't have a fluid mud, then often when you're getting that much resuspension, the water column is well mixed and it is oxygenated.
I have a question myself, if that's allowed. Julia, so I also really liked your talk, and I was wondering, I'm a little uncomfortable with oxygen exposure time because it's in seconds, and we like to characterize these deltas with non-dimensional numbers. So what's the thing we can divide it with to say something about carbon in deltas?
I have not yet thought about that. Give me a second. Let someone else ask a question and I'll think about it.
I'll ask a question then, but we'll come back to that, Julia. I have a question for Zeli. If you could pick one type of data or data synthesis that would help you out to validate the model or move forward with it, what would it be? Now we have two people thinking.
This is a challenging question. Let me think about it. So, what aspect you so from the hydrodynamic aspect or from the
just from our river ocean connections being well represented in the model? Like, what type of data would you want to see more of or synthesized? What's been a big headache?
So I think right now the big headache is usually in the coverage of the data. So so especially for the sediment data, they usually first of all, they are very uncertain. So I think right now the USGS gauge data is pretty good from the usability to the model validation perspective. But the problem one is the quality. So the uncertainty is too large. Another one is they usually just cover very like specific days. Even the USGS gauge, their rating data also just cover specific days. And right now we have like the satellite data, sediment data, but they only cover maybe less than 5% of the days of every year. So this makes them not very useful for our model like validation. So that's I think my thought. Yeah.
So coming back to Yap's question, I think so when you use non-dimensional numbers, you have to be you're usually comparing two things, right? So it's what you are comparing the oxygen exposure time to. So in this case, we're thinking about carbon remineralization. So perhaps something related to the if time to remineralization, if it were not buried or if it were in some sort of good conditions for remineralization, perhaps time to remineralization. I'd have to think about it more, but that's my initial answer.
Thanks.
Okay, one last question for Bob.
I have a question that any of you are welcome to try to answer, but maybe Stanley, one of the, a phenomena during burial of sediments and diagenesis is that you can get sink switching. So for example, phosphorus goes from organic phosphorus to inorganic phosphorus. And so the amount buried of what originally comes in might come in as organic phases and ends up as a mix being buried. And so the same is true with carbon. So you start with organic carbon and you generate carbonate, and there's been some discussion about autogenic carbonates that are formed during burial. And so I'm wondering if the dynamics, for example, that you described in terms of how you deliver sediments and packages of certain quantities, how that impacts the relative sink switching of carbon that's eventually stored at a given site. Have you considered that?
We didn't really look into that deeply because one of the limitations, I didn't say that so much in the model, but one of the limitations is we didn't have first of all, we didn't have like a good account of like carbon precipitation. So yeah, it's something we're working on. We think we could include those kind of processing there. And so, but we didn't consider what you just said now. But I think perhaps might be useful for us to think in the future about these particulars.
So there's actually, as far as I know, and I can be corrected by perhaps people here, there are very few carbon burial budgets that include the inorganic autogenic carbon component that comes from the originally deposited organic matter.
Yeah.
And so I know in the Amazon Delta, about 30% of the carbon that's eventually buried is actually as autogenic carbonates. So it's a sink switching kind of thing. And then if you didn't measure that, you'd be off by that much of your estimate if you were only looking at organic carbon burial.
Yeah.
So I do think that that should be a component that's considered in all of our budgets, and it would be of great interest, I think, to see how the sedimentary dynamics that you get in terms of delivery, burial, and stability of packets of sediments, how that impacts the final products that you get in terms of the distribution of organic burial versus inorganic burial.
Yeah,
that would be something really interesting.
Yeah, we maybe you want to say or I go? So yeah. So what I want to say, yeah, I think one of the things that we were hoping to do next will be perhaps because I know if I understand from Christophe, they're trying to get this flux of organic carbon, the POC flux is at the boundary, right? So what that would help, in that to then we start to look into like the input, this input versus burial calculations in the model. For now, we didn't go that length because we only had like 1 point to do that kind of calculation. So it was really hard to do. And also, I would just point out, I don't know whether it's related to what you're saying. One of the things that we also were looking at was this pyrite formation. We kind of we did 1 or 2 small calculations on it, but we know that we're still very, very off from that from the calculation of the estimate that we think we want to do. But hopefully with data from Christophe with their recent cruise, we should be able to go back to that particular stuff. And I've seen some data from some of the results from OCR's posters showing the DIC stuff. This was something that was never there when I was having this calculation. So this, hopefully with this new set of data, we can go back again and try to think about this whole carbon, this switching that you mentioned, and maybe we'll see if we could create some like a budget for that one.
I have to add one more thing. I know I heard a buzzer. Does that mean we're done? Well, I'm going back to Julia actually. So one of the things that one finds, of course, in many of these environments are benthic fauna.
Sure.
And they transport those particles between the oxic and anoxic zone in different directions. They can excavate deeply buried anoxic material and they can subduct oxidized material.
Yes.
They also alter the properties of the interface and thus its susceptibility to suspension and resuspension. So I'm wondering, are you incorporating bioturbation in any of your calculations about OET?
Not explicitly, only to the extent that like burrowing and stuff like that impacts where the oxygen penetration depth is. And so it would be represented within the oxygen penetration depth. We are not accounting for the impact on erodibility.
All right. I think that was it for the panel. Thank you so much.